The air in Miami was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin like a second layer. It was late, but the city never truly slept. Neither did I. I sat in my dimly lit apartment, staring at the blood slide between my fingers. A tiny, damning piece of glass, holding the truth of what I was, what I had done. Lucas Vega. Not a monster, not a predator, just a man, a good man. The thought gnawed at me like a dull blade dragging across flesh. I had killed before many times, but never like this. Never against the code. Harry's code. My code. I could still see his face, frozen in fear and confusion as the needle plunged into his neck. He had fought, not like a killer clawing for survival, but like a man who still believed in justice. He had been too close, too sharp, too damn persistent. He had looked at me in those final moments, his lips moving as if to plead for an explanation, or maybe forgiveness. I gave him neither, and now I was unraveling. The dark passenger, once my guiding force, had turned against me. It whispered doubts, filled my mind with static. You're no different. You're just like them. For the first time in my life, I couldn't argue. My hands trembled as I placed the blood slide into its rightful place among the others. I wanted to believe it fit there, that it belonged. But it stood out, glaring, an ugly stain among the carefully curated trophies of my justice. I had broken the one rule that kept me sane. A knock at my door sent a jolt through my spine. I moved quickly, composing myself as I opened it. Deb. Her eyes were sharp, studying me in that way only she could. "You look like shit," she said, stepping inside uninvited. I forced a smirk. "Long night." She crossed her arms, her badge gleaming in the dim light. "Vega's missing." I felt my body stiffen. "That so?" She nodded, her gaze never leaving mine. He was onto something, was asking questions about some old cases, cold cases, and now, poof, gone. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "Any leads?" Her jaw tightened. "No, but I have a feeling whoever made him disappear didn't cover their tracks as well as they think. A warning, or a challenge." I exhaled slowly, careful to keep my expression neutral. Deborah was smart, too smart. If I wasn't careful, I'd lose more than just my grip on reality. I'd lose everything. As she turned to leave, she hesitated at the door. "If you hear anything, you'll tell me, right?" I nodded, lying as easily as breathing. "Of course." She left, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I had always prided myself on control, on precision. But now I was slipping, and if I wasn't careful, I wouldn't just lose Deborah's trust. I'd lose myself. The door clicked shut behind Deborah, but her presence lingered like the smell of gunpowder after a shot. I stood there, unmoving, listening to the silence as if it might reveal something. Some hidden answer buried beneath the weight of my own thoughts. But there was nothing. Just the low hum of the air conditioning, the distant wail of sirens cutting through the Miami night, and the quiet, insidious voice in my head whispering the truth. I had made a mistake. Lucas Vega wasn't like the others. He didn't fit the code. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't a predator. He was just a man, and now a dead one. I turned back to my trophies, my fingers hovering over the slide that didn't belong. The others, my true kills, sat in their neat little rows, each one a testament to Harry's teachings, to the rules that had kept me hidden, kept me safe. But this one was different. It was wrong, and wrong had a way of catching up to me. A vibration rattled my pocket. I pulled out my phone, my stomach twisting when I saw the name on the screen. Harry. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, not the fractured echoes of my subconscious clawing their way to the surface. The real Harry Morgan. I hesitated for only a second before answering. "Dad." His voice came through steady, calm in a way that sent ice through my veins. "We need to talk." I swallowed. There was something in his tone, something I hadn't heard since I was a boy. Not anger, not disappointment, something worse. Doubt. I kept my voice even. "About what?" A pause. Then, "Lucas Vega." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What about him?" "Don't play games with me, Dexter," Harry said, low and sharp. "Not with this." My grip on the phone tightened. Harry had always been the one person who truly saw me, who understood what I needed. And now, for the first time, I wasn't sure if that was a good thing. I forced myself to breathe. "Where are you?" "Your place," he said. "Look outside." I turned, my pulse spiking as I stepped toward the window. The street below was mostly dead, save for the occasional car rolling by, headlights slicing through the darkness. But then I saw him, a lone figure, standing near the curb beneath the sickly glow of a street lamp. Harry. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there watching, waiting. I exhaled slowly, willing my heartbeat to steady. Then, without another word, I hung up, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. The air outside was thick, the kind that clung to your skin, made it hard to breathe. I stepped onto the pavement, my shoes scuffing against the concrete as I approached him. Harry's face was unreadable, his eyes shadowed by the dim light, but I could feel it, the weight of his gaze, the unspoken accusation. "You're slipping," he said. I stopped a few feet away, the space between us feeling like a chasm. "I don't know what you mean." Harry's lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't lie to me, Dex. Dex. Not son. Not kiddo. Just Dex." A small, insignificant detail, but one that landed like a punch to the gut. I swallowed. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth." I forced a breath, my mind racing through possibilities, through ways to spin this, to salvage it. But there was no salvaging this. Not with him. "I made a mistake," I admitted, the words tasting like ash. Harry nodded, slow and deliberate. "And now what? Now what?" The question hung between us, heavy and suffocating. Now I cover my tracks. Now I make sure Deb never finds out. Now I try to convince myself that this won't happen again. But Harry wasn't asking about my cover-up. He was asking about something else. Something deeper. Something I didn't want to answer. I clenched my jaw. "It won't happen again." Harry studied me for a long moment. "It will," he said finally. "That's the problem." I felt something tighten in my chest. "You don't know that, don't I?" His voice was quiet, but it cut through me like a blade. "You broke the code once. You'll break it again. And the next time, it'll be easier." I shook my head. "No, you'll justify it. Tell yourself it was necessary. That they were close to finding you. That they left you no choice." He took a step closer, his voice still calm, still steady. "That's how it starts, Dexter." A flicker of something sharp and ugly curled in my stomach. "You don't trust me." Harry didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time in my life I saw it. Fear. Not of what I was, of what I was becoming. The realization hit harder than I wanted to admit. Harry had built the code to protect me, to keep me from becoming a monster, to keep me from becoming this. But now, standing here beneath the glow of a street lamp in the thick Miami heat, I saw the truth. The code hadn't saved me. It had just delayed the inevitable. I took a step back. "I can fix this." Harry's gaze didn't waver. "I hope so." Hope. Not certainty. Not belief. Just hope. I turned away before I could see the disappointment settle into his features. Before I could let it sink into my own bones. I had work to do. Mistakes to erase, a life to protect, and a father to prove wrong. The night swallowed me whole as I walked away from Harry, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air was thick, clinging to my skin like the guilt I refused to acknowledge. Each step felt heavier, as if my body was resisting the inevitable. I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. My fingers itched to do something, anything, to regain control. I needed to think, to plan, to fix this before it spiraled further. Lucas Vega was a mistake, but mistakes left evidence. And evidence led to consequences. I couldn't afford consequences. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. The neon-soaked streets of Miami bleeding together like a crime scene smeared by careless hands. When I finally stepped inside, the air felt stale, heavy with something unseen. I locked the door behind me, leaned against it, and exhaled. Then I saw him, Harry, not outside this time, not separated by the distance of a phone call or the glow of a street lamp. He was here, inside, standing in the dim light of my apartment. I blinked, my body tensing even though I knew, logically, that he wasn't real. But he felt real, more real than he had in years. "You should have stopped," he said, his voice low, measured. I pushed off the door, moving toward the kitchen, needing the barrier of movement. "I did what I had to do. You killed an innocent man." I grabbed a glass from the cabinet, filled it with water that I didn't really want. He was getting too close. Harry's silence was heavier than any accusation. I turned, meeting his gaze. "Would you rather I let him expose me? Let Deborah find out?" His expression didn't change. "I'd rather you weren't in this position at all." A bitter laugh escaped me. "Then maybe you shouldn't have made me this way." The words hit the air between us like a gunshot. Harry didn't flinch, but something shifted in his gaze. Regret, pain, something too human for the ghost I had created in my mind. I hated that look. I turned away, setting the glass down harder than necessary. "It's done. I'll clean it up. No one will find him." "You think that's the problem?" Harry asked. "That they'll find him?" I clenched my jaw. "That's the only problem that matters." Harry exhaled, shaking his head. "No, Dexter. The problem is you." I felt something cold curl in my stomach. "You always thought the code would keep you in check," he continued. "That it would keep you from becoming reckless. But it's failing, isn't it?" I didn't answer. "You're losing control," he said. "And if you don't stop now, you'll lose everything." I turned to face him fully, something sharp and angry rising in my chest. "Then tell me how to fix it." Harry's expression softened, but it wasn't the comfort I wanted. It was pity. "You can't," he said. The words settled over me like a death sentence. I shook my head. "No, I can. I just need to be more careful. I slipped up once, but You'll what?" Harry interrupted. "Be better? Be smarter? That's what you told yourself the last time. And the time before that." I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "This is different." Harry's gaze darkened. "No, Dexter. This is exactly the same." Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then, a knock at the door. I froze. Harry disappeared. The knock came again, sharper this time, more urgent. I moved toward the door, forcing my face into something neutral before opening it. "Deb," again. Her stance was tense, her eyes sharp, cutting through me like scalpels. "We need to talk," she said. I forced a smirk. "Didn't we already?" She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door, schooling my features into careful curiosity. "What's up?" She turned to face me, arms crossed. "Lucas Vega's car was found abandoned near the Everglades." My stomach twisted, but I kept my expression blank. "That's unfortunate." Deb narrowed her eyes. "Unfortunate?" Dexter, his laptop was missing, his apartment was trashed, and his phone was found in a dumpster. This wasn't some random disappearance. Someone made him disappear. I exhaled slowly. "And you think I know something about it?" She took a step closer, searching my face for something I couldn't afford for her to find. "He was looking into the Bay Harbor butcher case." My pulse spiked, but I kept my voice steady. "A lot of people have." "Yeah," she said, "but he was looking in the right places. And now he's gone." I shrugged. "Coincidence?" Deb scoffed. "Bullshit. She wasn't just fishing. She was certain." I leaned against the counter, folding my arms to mirror her stance. "You think someone killed him to keep him quiet?" Deb's jaw tightened. "I think someone killed him because they were scared." I forced a chuckle. "That doesn't sound like me." She didn't laugh, didn't smile, just stared. "You're different," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Her gaze flickered, uncertainty creeping in. "I don't know. You just feel off." I kept my expression carefully neutral. "Long nights at work. Stress. Maybe I need a vacation. Deb didn't move, didn't blink. Maybe. Silence stretched between us, thick and unspoken. Then, finally, she exhaled, running a hand through her hair. If you hear anything, I'll tell you, I said, the lie slipping out as easily as breathing. She nodded, but she didn't look convinced. She turned toward the door, hesitated, then glanced back at me. You sure you're okay? I smiled. Always. She didn't smile back. Then she left. The door clicked shut behind her, and I stood there, unmoving, listening to the silence. Harry materialized again, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. She knows, he said. I shook my head. She suspects. That's the same thing. I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. How much longer can you keep this up? Harry asked. I didn't answer, because I didn't know. I stood in the silence for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle over me like a shroud. Harry was right, Deborah knew. Maybe not in the way she would if she had cold, hard proof, but she knew something wasn't right. And that was enough. Enough to turn suspicion into certainty if I wasn't careful. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the street below. Deb's car was still there, parked a few spaces down, her silhouette visible through the windshield. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. She was waiting, watching, a test. I let the curtain slip back into place, forcing my breathing to slow. I had been here before, standing on the razor's edge between exposure and survival. But this was different. This time, the threat wasn't an overzealous cop or a rival predator. This time it was Deborah, and she wouldn't stop. I turned, expecting Harry to still be there, arms crossed, disapproval etched into the lines of his face. But he was gone. Good. I didn't need his judgment. I needed a plan. I moved toward my desk, pulling out the small, unassuming lockbox tucked away inside the bottom drawer. The key was always on me, a tiny insurance policy against the unexpected. I turned it in the lock, the mechanism clicking softly before I lifted the lid. Inside, the tools of my trade, untraceable cell phones, backup IDs, cash, everything I would need to disappear if it ever came to that. A contingency, a last resort. My fingers hovered over the burner phone before pulling away. No, not yet. There was still time to fix this, to regain control. I closed the box, locking it again before shoving it back into the drawer. Think, Lucas Vega's disappearance was a problem, but problems had solutions. His car had been found, his apartment ransacked. That meant someone, likely Deb, was digging deeper. I needed to be ahead of them. I grabbed my laptop, pulling up the Miami Metro database. A few keystrokes and I was in. I navigated to Vega's case file, scanning the preliminary findings. No body, no solid evidence. Just a missing man and a handful of loose threads that hadn't yet been tied into a noose. Yet, I kept scrolling. Witness statements, security footage requests, the usual dance of investigation. Then, something that made my stomach tighten. A forensic request. Blood samples recovered from Vega's apartment. I sat back, my mind racing. I had been careful, worn gloves, left no trace. But forensic science had a way of finding ghosts in places you never expected. A single drop, a fragment of skin, a stray hair, that was all it would take. I exhaled, forcing my thoughts to slow. The samples hadn't been processed yet. That meant I still had time. Miami Metro's lab was secure, but not impenetrable. I knew its blind spots, its weaknesses. I had worked there long enough to understand the system better than anyone. A plan began to form. I glanced back toward the window. Deb's car was gone. She had made her move. Now it was time for me to make mine. I stood, my hands steady again, my mind clear. The path forward was dangerous but necessary. I would erase the evidence. I would steer Deb away from the truth. I would fix this, because failure wasn't an option. And if Harry had doubts, if he thought I was slipping, then he was wrong. I wasn't losing control. I was taking it back. The hum of the city was distant, muffled by the thick Miami heat pressing against the walls of my apartment. The air was stale, carrying the scent of something I couldn't quite name. Anticipation, maybe, or inevitability. I stared at the laptop screen, the forensic request glaring back at me like an accusation. Blood samples from Vega's apartment. A mistake I couldn't afford. A loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel everything. I had to act fast. The lab was secure, but I knew its vulnerabilities. Nights were quieter. Fewer people. Fewer eyes. A small window of opportunity before evidence turned into something more dangerous. But before I could move, I needed to know how much Deborah had already uncovered. I grabbed my phone and dialed. She picked up on the second ring. "What?" Her voice was sharp, exhausted but alert. "Just checking in," I said, keeping my tone casual. "You seemed tense earlier." A scoff. "Yeah, well, a good cop disappears after digging into the Bay Harbor butcher case. That'll do it." I smiled faintly. "Any new leads?" A pause. Then, "You really want to know?" I wouldn't have asked. She exhaled, the sound crackling through the speaker. "We found blood at his place. Lab's running it now. If it's his, then we're dealing with a homicide. If it's not..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. "If it's not, it could be the killers." I kept my voice neutral. "That's good news, right? More evidence." "Yeah," she muttered. "Unless the evidence leads somewhere we don't want it to." Something in her tone sent a ripple of unease through me. "Meaning?" Another pause. Then, softer, more hesitant. "Dex, if I asked you something, would you be honest with me?" The question was a knife against my ribs. "Of course." She hesitated again, and for a moment, I thought she might actually say it. Might actually voice the suspicion tightening around her like a noose. But then, she sighed. "Never mind," she said. "I'll see you tomorrow." The line went dead. I lowered the phone, staring at the screen as if it might provide some kind of answer. She didn't ask, but she wanted to. Harry materialized in the reflection of the window, his expression unreadable. "She's closer than you think," he said. I didn't look at him. "She doesn't have proof." "She doesn't need proof," he countered. "She knows you, Dexter, and that's enough." I clenched my jaw. "Then I'll make sure she never finds any." Harry's silence was heavier than words. I stood, grabbed my keys, and slipped out into the night. The streets were quieter now, the city settling into its restless sleep. I drove without thinking, muscle memory guiding me toward Miami Metro. The building loomed ahead, sterile and familiar, the fluorescent glow of the lab casting long shadows against the pavement. I parked in my usual spot, scanning the lot. A few cars remained, night shift officers, lingering techs, but the forensic lab itself would be nearly empty. I stepped inside, my shoes barely making a sound against the tile. The hallway stretched before me, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I moved quickly, slipping past the bullpen and down toward the lab. The door was locked, but that was expected. I pulled out my keycard, the one privilege of being Miami Metro's resident blood spatter expert. The reader beeped softly. The door clicked open. Inside, the lab was dim, the hum of machines the only sound. The evidence lockers lined the back wall, each one secured, monitored. But I had been in and out of this room 1,000 times. I knew how things worked. I moved to the workstation, pulling up the logs. The blood samples from Vega's apartment had been processed but not yet cataloged. Perfect. I found the vials in the refrigerated storage, each one labeled, sealed. I scanned them quickly. Most were Vega's, but then a single vial. Unidentified. I felt something cold slither through me. Unidentified meant it didn't match Vega, which meant it belonged to someone else. Me? No, I had been careful. Hadn't I? I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the vial. It didn't matter. I couldn't take that risk. I moved quickly, pulling a disposable pipette from the drawer and removing the vial's cap. A few careful drops into the biohazard disposal. The liquid swirled, disappearing into the chemical abyss. Evidence erased. I replaced the vial, wiped down the workstation, and exited as quietly as I had come. As I stepped into the hallway, My pulse steady again. I felt a flicker of something close to relief. Then a voice. Dexter. I turned, my stomach twisting. Masuka. He stood at the end of the hall, lab coat wrinkled, coffee in hand. His eyes narrowed slightly, head tilted. What are you doing here? I forced an easy smile. Couldn't sleep. He chuckled. Yeah, well, you're not the only one. You see the blood samples from Vega's place. Casual. Innocent. I nodded. Briefly. Pretty interesting stuff. If the unidentified sample comes back with a hit, we might actually have something solid. I kept my expression neutral. Yeah, could be a breakthrough. Masuka took a sip of his coffee. You heading out? Yeah, I said. Long day tomorrow. He nodded, already distracted. Tell me about it. I turned, walking away before he could say anything else. The night air hit me like a wall, thick and humid, pressing against my skin. I exhaled, steadying myself. It was done. The evidence was gone. Deborah's search would hit a dead end. And I froze. Across the parking lot, standing in the shadows near my car, Harry. His gaze was dark, unreadable. And for the first time, I realized he wasn't looking at me like I was his son. He was looking at me like I was something else. Something worse. I swallowed, gripping my keys. I fixed it, I said. Harry didn't move. Did you? The question settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I turned away, climbed into my car, and drove. But even as the city blurred past me, I couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, I had already lost. The Miami night stretched endlessly before me, the neon lights bleeding into the darkness like a wound that refused to close. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I navigated the empty streets. The air in the car was thick, suffocating. Harry's face lingered in my mind, his expression carved into the back of my skull. Not as a father, not as a mentor, but as a man who had realized he had created something far worse than he ever intended. I fixed it. I had erased the evidence. And yet, the weight of it still sat heavy in my chest, pressing against my ribs like a vice. The moment I stepped into my apartment, I locked the door behind me, leaning against it as I exhaled. The silence was deafening, stretching between the walls like a living thing. My trophies were lined up neatly where they always were, but my gaze was drawn to the single slide that didn't belong. Lucas Vega, the mistake. I moved toward the box, my fingers hesitating over the glass. It was just a slide, just a fragment of blood, but it may as well have been a confession scrawled in crimson. Harry's voice broke through the silence. This won't stop, Dexter. I didn't turn. I handled it, I said. For now. I clenched my jaw. That's all that matters. A pause. Then softer, almost mournful. You're lying to yourself. The words cut through me, deeper than I wanted to admit. I closed my eyes, inhaling sharply, willing the doubt away. Then, a vibration from my phone. I pulled it out, my pulse spiking when I saw the name on the screen. Deborah. I answered, keeping my voice steady. Hey, you busy? I glanced at the blood slide still resting between my fingers. No, good. I need you to come down to the station. I stiffened. Why? A beat of silence. Then, they processed the blood from Vega's apartment. The walls closed in around me. I forced my voice to remain even. And there was something off in her tone. Something unreadable. Just get here. The line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, my mind racing through every possibility. I had destroyed the evidence. There was nothing left to find. Was there? I grabbed my keys, shoving my phone into my pocket as I headed out the door. The drive to Miami Metro felt longer than it should have. The city blurred past me, but my mind was elsewhere, dissecting every moment, every variable. Had I missed something? Left something behind? By the time I pulled into the parking lot, my pulse was a steady drumbeat in my ears. Inside, the station was quieter than usual, the late hour thinning the usual chaos. Deb was waiting near the bullpen, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. I forced a smirk. You gonna tell me what this is about? Or are we playing 20 questions? She didn't smile. Come with me. She turned, heading toward the lab. I followed, my body tense, every step measured. Masuka was inside, hunched over his workstation, but he straightened when he saw us. His usual smirk was absent, replaced with something else. Something I didn't like. Dex, he said, nodding. I nodded back, feigning curiosity. What's going on? Deb crossed her arms. You tell me. Masuka gestured to the screen where data scrolled in neat, clinical lines. We ran the blood samples, he said. I kept my expression neutral. And Masuka leaned back in his chair, studying me. Most of it was Vega's. I nodded. Makes sense. But one sample, he continued, came back different. Something in my stomach twisted. I forced a frown. Different how? Masuka exhaled, tapping the screen. It wasn't in the system. No matches. I stared at the data, my mind racing. That was impossible. I had disposed of the unidentified sample. I had made sure of it. Hadn't I? Deb's voice cut through the silence. So either we're dealing with someone who's never been in the system before. She turned to me, her gaze sharp, searching. Or someone who made sure their DNA wasn't there to begin with. The words hung heavy in the air. I kept my face blank. You think the killer tampered with the evidence? Masuka shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time. Deb didn't look convinced. She was watching me too closely, her eyes dissecting every movement, every breath. I needed to redirect. I sighed, rubbing my temples. So where does that leave us? Masuka leaned back. Now, we wait. The lab's running another scan, cross-referencing with older databases. If we get a hit, maybe we'll get a lead. My stomach clenched. Another scan. Another chance for something to go wrong. I forced a nod. Sounds like a plan. Deb didn't respond right away. Then, finally, yeah. She turned to Masuka. Let me know the second you get anything. He nodded, already turning back to his screen. Deb motioned for me to follow her out. The second we were in the hallway, she stopped, rounding on me. You sure you're okay? The question caught me off guard. I blinked. What? She studied me, her expression softer now. Less suspicion, more concern. You've been off lately, she said. I don't know if it's work or something else, but... She hesitated. If something's wrong, you can tell me. The words hit harder than they should have. I forced a chuckle. I'm fine, Deb. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. All right, she said. Get some sleep. I nodded, turning toward the exit. Each step felt heavier than the last. The second I was outside, I inhaled deeply, the night air thick in my lungs. I had fixed the evidence. I had erased my tracks. And yet, somehow, I was still drowning. I moved toward my car, fishing my keys from my pocket, then froze. A figure stood in the shadows near the edge of the lot, watching me. Harry. His face was unreadable, his presence heavier than before. I clenched my jaw. What now? His voice was quiet. You can't run from this. I exhaled sharply. I'm not running. Harry tilted his head. Aren't you? I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure anymore. I climbed into my car, gripping the wheel. The city stretched before me, endless and consuming. And for the first time, I wondered if I was already too far gone. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles whitening as the weight of the night settled over me. The city pulsed beyond the windshield, a neon-drenched beast that never slept, but I felt trapped in a moment that refused to move forward. Harry was right again. I was running, not in the way that left footprints or tire tracks, but in the way that seeped into my bones, in the way that made every breath feel stolen. I had cleaned up my mistake, erased the evidence, and yet, something still felt wrong. Deborah was close, too close. Even if she didn't have proof, she had something worse, doubt. Doubt could turn into obsession. Obsession could turn into truth. And truth would destroy me. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to focus. I needed to stay ahead of this. The lab was running another scan, but I had done enough to ensure they would find nothing. No DNA, no viable leads, just a dead end. But Harry's words clung to me like the Miami humidity. You can't run from this. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life beneath me. The city stretched before me, roads twisting into endless possibilities. I could drive to the ocean, keep going, disappear, start over. But no, I wasn't done yet. I pulled out of the lot, merging onto the main road, my mind already moving to the next step. Deborah wasn't going to drop this. Her instincts were too sharp, her determination too relentless. She wouldn't stop until she had answers. And if she got too close, no. I couldn't think like that. Not about Deb. The thought of losing her, of being the reason she was gone, twisted something deep inside me. Something I wasn't ready to face. I needed to redirect her. She was looking in the right places, but if I steered her toward the wrong conclusions, I could buy myself time. Time to fix this. Time to regain control. I drove through the city, the streetlights casting jagged shadows across the pavement. My fingers tapped against the wheel, my mind spinning through possibilities. An anonymous tip, a planted lead, a new suspect to chase, something, anything. Then, a flash of movement in my rearview mirror. Headlights, close, too close. A coincidence? Maybe. The roads weren't empty, even this late. But something about the way the car moved, the way it matched my turns, sent a prickle of unease down my spine. I changed lanes. So did they. I took a left. They followed. Not a coincidence. A tail. I felt my pulse steady, my mind sharpening. There were two possibilities. 1, Deb had put someone on me. 2, someone else was watching. Neither was good. I kept my speed steady, my hands relaxed on the wheel. If they thought I hadn't noticed, they might get sloppy. I took another turn, this time into a quieter street, the kind lined with warehouses and forgotten spaces. Fewer eyes. The car followed. I exhaled slowly. All right, let's see who you are. I pressed the gas, not enough to draw immediate suspicion, just enough to test them. They matched my speed, persistent. I took another turn, then another, weaving through the streets in a slow, calculated pattern. The car stayed with me, not just a tail, a hunter. I clenched my jaw, my mind shifting gears. If they wanted to follow me into the shadows, I would show them what lived there. I took a sharp right, down an alley barely wide enough for 2 cars. The buildings pressed in on either side, the streetlights flickering overhead. The car hesitated. Then it followed. I smiled. Got you. I killed the headlights, rolling to a stop behind a row of dumpsters. The alley swallowed me whole, my car blending into the darkness. Now we wait. The other car slowed, its headlights washing over the pavement as it crawled forward. I watched, waited. The driver hesitated. Then the engine cut. A door opened. A figure stepped out. I leaned forward, my breath steady, my heart slow. The figure moved cautiously, scanning the alley, searching. Then, as the light caught their face, I froze. Not a cop, not a rival predator. Deborah. My stomach twisted. She had been following me. She hadn't sent someone else. She'd done it herself. I watched as she paced near her car, her hands on her hips, her body tense. She wasn't just suspicious anymore. She was certain. She just didn't have the proof. Yet, I exhaled slowly, my mind already working through the next steps. I could sit here, let her leave, pretend I never saw her. Or I could confront her, turn the game around, take control. I made my choice. I opened the door, stepping out into the night. She turned, her body going rigid. Jesus Christ, Dexter. I smiled, keeping my voice light. Following me now? That's not very subtle. Her jaw tightened. You were acting weird. So yeah, I followed you. I arched an eyebrow. And she hesitated, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. And I don't know what the hell you're doing, but I know you're hiding something. I tilted my head. That's a bold accusation. She took a step forward, her eyes burning into mine. Lucas Vega was looking into the Bay Harbor butcher before he disappeared. Now you're acting strange. Sneaking around, showing up at the lab in the middle of the night. I kept my expression neutral. Coincidence. Bullshit. Her voice was sharp, raw with something more than just suspicion. Pain. Fear. She wanted me to tell her she was wrong. She wanted me to give her a reason to believe in me. I could lie. I could spin another story, buy myself more time. But looking at her, at the way she was searching my face for something, anything, to hold on to, I felt something crack. She deserved better. I took a slow breath. And then, I made my final mistake. I didn't lie. I didn't tell her what she wanted to hear. Instead, I said, "You should stop looking, Deb." Her breath hitched. Not an admission. Not a confession. But enough. Her eyes widened, her body going still. Dexter, I swallowed. I had spent my life staying one step ahead. But now I had just given her the one thing she needed. A reason to keep going. A reason to find the truth. A reason to destroy me. The air between us was thick, suffocating. Then finally she exhaled and whispered, "Oh my God, I had lost."